You are all such a wonderful group of people. You quiet down right when we're supposed to start. I don't have to do anything. Good morning. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us here today to learn more about the basics of biosimilars. And I think in some ways it's a little bit of a misnomer because there's like nothing basic about this issue, but we're gonna try to walk you through it. My name is Sarah Dash. I am the president and CEO of the Alliance for Health Policy. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Alliance, we are a nonpartisan organization that really is mission focused on advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. So we are here to serve as a resource for the policymakers and the policymaking community. We do not have any legislative or regulatory agenda of our own. We simply want to serve as a forum to share the information so those of you who do work on these issues can have the best information possible at your fingertips. A couple of quick notes. We're really delighted, and we're gonna kick off the program in a minute. This event is on the record, and we will also be live tweeting during today's event, so you can join us with the hashtag AllHealthLive. And just kind of a couple quick notes about the topic today. So biologic drugs, and our panelists are going to get into this a little bit, but biologic drugs, which are developed from living cells and organisms, are in many ways kind of the cutting edge of science today, and they can stimulate the body to combat debilitating diseases like cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and others. What we're here to talk about today is the relationship between these biologics and the development and sale of biosimilars, which are drugs that are designed to share the structure and functionality of innovator biologics, and how those relate to patient treatment, patient access, and to healthcare costs. So I'm not going to say too much more because these guys are the experts. But before I get started, I do want to thank Johnson & Johnson for making today's briefing possible. And I'm going to invite Scott White to make a few brief remarks. Scott is the company group chairman of North American Pharmaceuticals at J&J, to make a couple of remarks. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Sarah, and special thanks to the Alliance for Health Policy. So good morning, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Scott White. I lead the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies for Johnson & Johnson in the U.S. I'm really pleased to see so many people interested in learning more about these highly complex medicines that we're going to discuss today called biologics. Biologics are a critically important class of medicines that can transform the lives of patients battling progressive, irreversibly damaging, and often life-threatening diseases, including cancer, chronic disease, autoimmune diseases, and infectious diseases. At Johnson & Johnson, we've been working on the discovery and development of biologics for more than 30 years. And with the rest of our colleagues in the industry, we'd like to believe we've come a long way in providing important treatments. Today, biologics are being used to treat millions of patients around the world. Finding the right treatment and becoming stable on that treatment can be a long and arduous journey for any of these patients. Biosimilars, or near copies of biologic medicines, have the potential to increase competition and bring down costs, which is why Janssen has long supported a patient-focused and science-based regulatory framework for biosimilars. Biosimilars are not generics, and like all new biologic medicines, new biosimilars need to earn the trust of patients and physicians in order for uptake to happen. This will require, in a large part, robust standards for biosimilars and interchangeable products, as well as evaluation of biosimilar to biosimilar switching. As I turn over the floor, there are three things I'd like to leave with the folks in this room and online. The first is that confidence rooted in evidence, will support the uptake of biosimilars. Second is that competition is working. We have a highly competitive market and framework in the United States. We do see where biosimilars have launched, prices are falling. And the third thing is that policies should be available to maintain a level playing field between biosimilar products as well as between biosimilars and their reference products. So with that, Sarah, thank you very much, and thanks again to the Alliance for Health Policy, and we're really looking forward to having a great discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Each of these panelists has really important and different perspectives on this topic. For those of you, if you want, there are a couple of seats up here up front and over there if you want to go ahead and make yourself comfortable. Buckle up. All right. Joining us today, we have Dr. Samir Asari, who is an Associate Executive Director for the Permanente Medical Group. He's in charge of pharmacy, adult and family medicine, mental health, risk-adjusted coding, revenue cycle, outside medical services, pain management, and the opioid initiative. So quite a few things in his portfolio. Dr. Asari joined the Permanente Medical Group in 1993, and he received his bachelor's degree in biology and his MD from UC Irvine, and he's a fellow of the American College of Physicians. Next, we're going to hear from Jeremy Sharp, who is a Senior Vice President at Waxman Strategies. Jeremy has policy experience in both the executive and legislative branches of the federal government. Most recently, in government, he served as Deputy Commissioner for Policy Planning, Legislation, and Analysis at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA. Before working there, Jeremy served as Legislative Director for Senator Christopher J. Dodd. Senator Chris Dodd as a professional and staff member on the Senate Help Committee, Subcommittee on Children and Families. So welcome, Jeremy. We will then hear from Adam Fine, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Drug Channels Institute. Dr. Fine has delivered educational programs across the country to more than 55,000 executives across a wide range of industries. Every talk is customized to meet their specific needs of their audience, and so he works with a number of folks across the industry, and he's going to talk to us today about some of the market regulation and dynamics and payment issues associated with biosimilars and biologics. And then we're delighted to be joined today by Anna Hyde, who is Vice President of Advocacy and Access at the Arthritis Foundation. She oversees both the federal and state legislative programs, in addition to grassroots engagement. Prior to joining the Arthritis Foundation in 2014, Anna was a senior manager for federal affairs at the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, where she managed a numerous portfolio of health policy issues, and began her health policy career right here on the Hill as a congressional fellow for the Energy and Commerce Committee. With that, I am delighted to turn it over to Dr. Asari to start our panel. You all have slides in your packets, and they will be broadcast up here. Dr. Asari, go ahead.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Samir Asari, actually an internal medicine physician. I still practice in addition to doing some of those other things on the side. So I work at Kaiser Permanente, which hopefully you're familiar with, one of the largest integrated delivery systems in the United States, taking care of almost 12 million patients across many states and the District of Columbia. We have office right down by Union Station. So pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about biosimilars. And I think it was already mentioned that biosimilars are a little bit different than generic drugs. Because generic drugs are exactly the same ingredient as the brand name drug. And the dosage is the same, the way it's administered is the same, the safety is the same, and the performance characteristics are exactly the same. So patients are not quite familiar with generics and feel pretty comfortable taking those. Biosimilars, on the other hand, are actually made from living organisms. Sometimes the cells are from rats, sometimes they're from humans, sometimes from mice, etc. So they're not exactly the identical agent as generics are. And so there can be some variation in the cell oh, did I not turn the mic on? There can be some variation in the biologic, but when research is done, there's actually no clinical meaningful difference. So in a way, they're like a generic, but they're not exactly like a generic. So that's important for you to see. And you can see a little depiction there that generic drugs are small molecules versus these biologic molecules are large. So I think I wanted to focus you on really what problem are we trying to solve in this country. And what you see up there is data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is not actually related to Kaiser Permanente, but 1 out of 4 people in the United States actually have a difficult time affording their medicine. And it's all of them, biosimilars and just regular kinds of medicines as well. And today, prescription drug prices account for almost 16% of what people are spending on their health care. So definitely an issue, and if you follow any of the polls, 75% of Americans are really worried about the cost of affording their medication. So the Rand Institute did a study very recently, and they discussed that if we really had an uptake of biosimilars like we're having in Europe and other parts of the world, we could have a potential reduction of almost $54 billion in healthcare spending, and definitely want to make sure we can have that. For us as an integrated delivery system, it's the same money that we get from our purchasers, and we have to decide, are we going to spend it on drugs, build a new hospital, get the next MRI machine, lower the cost of insurance for our members. So it's really important if one piece of the pie is starting to take more and more of that money that we get in, we really have to figure out how to take care of our patients. And the New York Times, and I'm not knocking Humira, but they had an article on Humira recently that the price goes up every 5 months, and if you actually look over the last 2.6 years, the price went up 64%. I'm sure the manufacturing costs did not keep going up through all of those times. So definitely is a concern for an integrated delivery system, a concern for my patients who actually have copays and have to pay for these medications. So this slide was made in December, and my colleague Jeremy just pointed out to me that there's now 17 biosimilars approved in the United States, and currently only 3 of them are available for patient use. And you might say, well, what the heck is happening? Well, a lot of it is actually tied up in patent litigation. So I just listed a few of them. Many of the pharmaceutical companies are litigating, and that has held off a launch of many of the biosimilars that are available in the rest of the world. Sometimes there's a phenomenon called pay for delay. So you might have heard about a particular pharmaceutical company telling a different one to hold off bringing a product to market. And I think there is I won't mention the name, you can just Google it, you'll find it. But they call it a licensing issue or whatever they want to call it. And I think John mentioned that perhaps we ought to be looking at how the laws are made in this nation and whether that is a good thing for our patients. So here's the EU, and maybe they've got 3 more biosimilars, I'm not sure, but they actually have 53 of these approved already. But they did get a head start on us. They started getting these biosimilars out perhaps a decade ago, and their laws were a little different. And so they definitely have had many more biosimilars. So there's 15 products with 53 biosimilars. So again, a little bit ahead of us. They have a lot of data on safety, use, et cetera, compared to what we have here in the United States. So what has that done? So if you take a look at that slide, the cost of biosimilars in Portugal went down 66%. And there you see a whole bunch of different countries from Europe where you actually see that the entrance of biosimilars has increased competition and actually lowered the price. But the graph on the right is really the most interesting one, because as the prices went down, patients were actually able to afford it. So when people needed these drugs and the prices were reasonable, they're actually able to take their therapy. And as many of you know, 1/3 of our patients don't actually listen to things we tell them. And I've had patients who could not afford their drug and were taking it every other day and got sick and got admitted to the hospital. And finally, when you try to find out what happened, we have them on the right therapy. They'll say, my goodness, doc, I didn't tell you. Couldn't afford my medicine. I wasn't taking it like I was supposed to take it. We had to get them financial assistance, and they did well. So again, it's not just competition and lowering the price. It's actually getting our patients what they need at a price that they can afford. So here's what's important to physicians like me and in Kaiser Permanente and the rest of the country. There's a lot of misinformation about biosimilars because they're not like generics, identical compounds. So people often wonder, is this effective? Is it just as safe? Is the presentation the same? and I'm seeing a patient who's well controlled on their medication. Now I have to talk to them about a biosimilar, and they're going to go, "Are you sure, doc? Do you want me to switch this medication? I've been doing well for a few years. Why do you want me to switch?" And again, sometimes there are differences in patient convenience. As you see, a lot of the patents on biosimilars, on biologics are gone, and biosimilars are coming out, and now they're actually changing the formulation just a little bit. Maybe it doesn't have citrate, or maybe instead of taking it 2 times a month, you now have to take it once a month. And guess what? The next biosimilar is 20 years away. So we're changing the convenience factor a little bit, and if I was the patient, I definitely want that convenience, but the price is going to be tremendously higher. So those are the sorts of questions that I think patients have as well, and I'm going to hold off on that because Anna is going to give you a lot of information on the patient perspective. But this is kind of what's on the physicians' minds when they have to think about whether they should switch to a biosimilar. So I want to give you an example of Zarzio, which we use for neutropenia. Neutropenia is when your immune system is suppressed after chemotherapy. And when the first biologic came out, this is the biosimilar for Neupogen, we were faced with whether we should use this in Kaiser Permanente. And as usual, my doc said, "Well, the research is from Europe." I said, "So? Is there any American research?" "All right, now we have research from America." "Well, how does it work in our patients?" I said, "All right, why don't we try it in some of the new patients who have not been on it and see what happens?" So we actually did our own little study, and when we used Zarzio compared to Neupogen, we actually found that there was less neutropenia with the biosimilar. Maybe it was a bio-better, but it wasn't statistically significant. And that actually convinced our physicians. And then we went to pharmacy contracting and we said, "You know what? These two things are equivalent and the safety is the same and the patients do really well. Can you go get a good contract?" And I believe the makers of Neupogen said, "No way." And we said, "All right, we'll move the entire market share if you don't work with us." And actually, they didn't believe us, but here's what happened then. Today, almost 98% of the product that we use in Kaiser Permanente is Zarzio, and Neupogen is almost gone. And similarly, we had a new biosimilar that came out last year, which is Inflectra, which is for Remicade. And you might be shocked that our market share, according to Pfizer last year, was 80% compared to the national market share of 2.3. And I checked this year, Jeremy, we're down to 50%, which means we're making progress in this country and other people are actually adopting biosimilars. But again, it requires a lot of education on behalf of our physicians, on behalf of our patients. And again, Remicade has many different indications. So our rheumatologist said, "Yep, no problem. European studies are good. We can switch. Not a problem." Our dermatologist said, "Yeah, we can do that too." Our gastroenterologists weren't as sure, and they said, "Well, it's complicated. Even Remicade doesn't work all of the time. And if my patient's stable, am I going to switch?" And it took a little bit of effort. But as you can see, these numbers have now improved. And again, we have significant cost savings, which we can then use to build another office building like the one they have next to Union Station, or actually afford the next CAR T therapy, or the $4 million drug that Novartis is trying to bring out. So often this actually just allows us to have access for our patients to the next best thing, which is a good thing. So I think the US biosimilars market is at a critical juncture. And even though the uptake is improving, it definitely has not materialized like it has in Europe. We definitely lag in the number of products we have. We actually have not seen the price reductions as high as you see in Portugal. It's definitely not 66%. And there may be several reasons for it. Definitely physicians not being educated about how well they work, patients not understanding how they work, PBMs maybe not putting it on there. Maybe some pay for delay going on. And this is in spite of these drugs having really good efficacy and safety. So that definitely is something we hopefully can talk about here today, and perhaps you all have some questions as well. And then as you mentioned, John, definitely there ought to be some policies looking at what can make this work a little better for our nation. Our patients are depending on it. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sari. And I once heard it said that making a generic was kind of like making a chocolate chip cookie, like a Nestle Toll House cookie, and making a biologic is more like making a souffle. So I don't know if you sort of would agree with that conception, but these are certainly more complicated drugs and complicated diseases. Is that, would you say
They
that's right?
absolutely are much more complicated than a generic, which is an identical substance. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. All right, Jeremy Sharp, bring us into the FDA world.
All right, good morning. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for having me here, Sarah. My name is Jeremy Sharp. I'm a Senior Vice President of Waxman Strategies, as Sarah said. Waxman Strategies is a public affairs consulting firm here in DC. We work with a variety of clients on issues that were near and dear to our chairman's heart, Henry Waxman, former member of Congress. And one of those issues we get to work on is drug pricing and how various policies affect that. And we enjoy that. We enjoy getting to work on that very much. We'd love to be able to help solve some of the problems so we don't have to work on it anymore, but that's probably a little idealistic. Today, what I've been asked to speak to you all about is both the regulatory regime that FDA works on and some of the history legislatively and regulatorily this works, and basically how is FDA thinking about biosimilars and to a lesser extent interchangeables. So just because the audience ranges from people who clearly know more than I do about this issue to people who are just starting out in this, I wanted to start with a few of the basics. FDA, or actually the US government, has been regulating biologics and drugs for more than 100 years in various forms. Some of that regulation isn't anything like what we would recognize today. The modern regime dates back to the middle of the last century, roughly, with some significant modifications, mainly in 1997, and then a few other pieces along the way. The components of FDA regulation are largely bucketed into pre-market review of applications, which is the requirement that companies submit large-scale clinical trials in 3 different phases to FDA. They do the clinical trials in 3 phases. They submit them all at once to FDA. And for FDA to evaluate those clinical trials to see if they demonstrate safety and efficacy and the balances of risk and benefit for those products. And that's a long-standing standard that FDA has used to evaluate medical products in this country. We'll get into why that's important in a second. FDA regulates labeling, what the company and what the drug label can say about the product, what it can do, what its risks are, what its safety is. This is a critical part of FDA's ability to regulate products, and importantly, FDA also has rules about what companies are allowed to say that is not on the label, and that is also just as critical. This is not an issue that has become as hot with biosimilars yet, but there's some sub-factors in there that will matter. Manufacturing, FDA always makes sure that the manufacturing of the product is up to snuff and safe. That's particularly important with biologics and biosimilars. And then, of course, post-market surveillance and adverse event reporting. Once it's on the market, we find out, does it work the way the clinical trials show? Is it safe? Is it effective? What are the risks that we didn't understand when we first looked at this product? FDA's regulation of biosimilars, as I said, biologics dates back a ways, but their regulation of biosimilars really can be dated back to about 2006, when after the European Union, EMA approved a growth hormone biosimilar. A company took FDA to court to get them to approve Omnitrope. At first, FDA was not prepared to do that, but the federal court made them do that. And they used the 505(b)(2) pathway, which is a complicated new drug application pathway that existed in the law at the time, to approve Omnitrope. However, FDA said at the time, this is not a pathway for approving biosimilars, and we do not have the legal authority to do that, and we don't have the structural way to make that happen. So that kicked off, or I should say it accelerated, a congressional debate about whether or not and how to give FDA that authority. And for about 4 years, that debate raged. There were a number of bills introduced by members ranging from my boss, Chairman Waxman, to Chuck Schumer, to Ted Kennedy, to Judd Gregg in the Senate. Orrin Hatch was involved with Senator Kennedy, to try to find compromises. And Congress debated things about what should these be called? Should they be generic biologics? Should they be follow-on biologics? Should they be biosimilars, interchangeables? Some of the terminology that we now accept today wasn't necessarily what was going to happen. And there were debates about how much exclusivity a product should have, how long a biologic should, a reference product, a brand name biologic should have on the market without competition. And there were questions about what standards should be set in law. Some of the standards range from just comparability to much more robust measures of therapeutic equivalence or therapeutic matching. Finally, in 2010, the Affordable Care Act was passed, and as part of that legislation, the Biologic Price Competition and Innovation Act was included. And this laid out what is the current mechanism by which FDA regulates biosimilars and interchangeables. And we're now in this period that started in 2010 of FDA implementing that law. A key piece for people to understand about this, Samir touched on this, but biosimilars are not generics, they are not identical, and the statute lays out for FDA a standard for biosimilars. That is, it must be highly similar with no clinically meaningful differences from the reference product, and that's in terms of safety, purity, and potency. That means it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but there needs to be evidence that FDA looks at and considers to make sure that it basically works the same way and has the same impact in the human body, generally speaking. The interchangeable standard is a higher standard. The interchangeable biosimilar can be expected to produce the same clinical results in any given patient as the reference product. And the sponsor may also need to demonstrate that if you switch between the reference product and to the interchangeable and back, that there'll be no greater risk to that switch or being on the interchangeable than there would have been if you had remained on the reference product. And this gets at what Samir was talking about in terms of establishing some of the confidence in the provider groups and the patients. So how does FDA think about this? FDA is very committed to making sure this program works, that the biosimilars are available, that we have a high degree of confidence in them, and they think about it in a few different ways. One is they want to make sure that as any product that is approved by the FDA, biosimilar, interchangeable, or biologic, there's a high degree of confidence in the patient community, the provider community, and the payer community that that product is safe and effective and worth covering, worth taking, worth prescribing for your patient. This relates to the next bullet here, immunogenicity. I should clarify. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, and not an economist. So there are many ways in which I was an odd duck when I was at FDA. So everything I've learned about this product, I've learned from the scientists, doctors, economists, and lawyers at FDA about how this works. Immunogenicity is one of the words they taught me, which is with these kind of products, one of the major clinical concerns is that slight changes in the chemical structure of a biologic can have more profound effects on the human body than is expected from the slightness of that change. And of particular concern is, does a biosimilar cause an immune response in the human body that either causes a safety issue for the patient involved or at the very least undermines the effectiveness of that product? And so FDA wants to be confident that the biosimilars and interchangeables that are approved are not at greater risk on that front. The third major point I would talk about here is pharmacovigilance. FDA, because of this complexity, because of this new space that we're in, where they are going to be, actually let me talk about the approval process for biosimilars before I talk about this. Essentially with a regular drug, you submit clinical trials, you've done them in 3 phases. Those clinical trials have to demonstrate safety and efficacy. That is not the standard for biosimilars. You need to have the standard on the page before, which means that a product sponsor submits applications that are made up of analytical studies, functional assays, and then some clinical data that they have developed, but not nearly in the quantity or volume that was done for a new drug application or a biological license agreement. And so so FDA is essentially getting a lot less data when they're looking at biosimilars, and that's what makes it cheaper for a company to do, in theory. The risk there is that they may not get all the information that they would have wanted or they're used to getting for a product of this complexity. So a high importance for FDA is pharmacovigilance, the ability to track these products once they're on the market, see how they're working, see what adverse events are happening, and how that traces back to either a biosimilar project or its biologic reference product. And that's some of what's driving some of FDA's decisions on guidances and policies that they have made. FDA's made a lot of progress in this time. I think many people would say, oh my gosh, it's very slow. Having been inside of FDA, I feel like the FDA has gotten quite a bit done, and it's a lot harder to get these things done than we expect. Since its enactment, at least by my count, FDA has approved 17 biosimilars in matching 9 different reference projects. They have 65 enrollees in their biosimilar product development program. And this is a program by which a company enrolls and engages with FDA trying to develop its clinical data assembly program so that they are doing the right work ahead of time before they're submitting to FDA. A number of reference products are already have had meetings with FDA, and then there have been a bunch of guidances. My count was 11 roughly. There are more to come. Commissioner Gottlieb has made a major priority of trying to improve FDA on this matter. He launched in summer of last year the Biosimilar Action Plan, which laid out in 4 categories some of the things he wants to do. Generally speaking, I'll let you read the slide, but generally speaking, some of the things that he has talked about doing is trying to make sure that FDA is giving more clarity to companies about what FDA expects, is trying to give more tools to companies for them to develop the data that FDA will expect, and then more communications with the outside world about how this is going to work. The least fleshed out part of his plan is the reducing gaming of this. We've talked about patents and pay for delay. His plan lays out an intention to work with the Federal Trade Commission and to address some REMS issues that also exist in the generic space. These are issues that I expect he will be putting more flesh on the bones of later, but they haven't been laid out quite as much as some of the other matters. Some of the questions that I think policymakers may want to think about as they're considering this, as they're trying to create a stronger biosimilar market, is what are the actual biggest obstacles to biosimilars coming to market? Is it the regulatory standards by which the product gets approved and reviewed and approved? Is it the litigation that happens after approval? Is it the reimbursement that happens at the back end? Is there a market there for companies to decide they're going to invest in? People on this panel will be better equipped to speak to those answers than I will in some cases, but I think that's a major threshold question all policymakers should be thinking about before they dive into answers. Some of the questions that relates to the regulatory question is, has FDA gotten this right? Are they assessing the risk correctly here? Are they creating this right standards? Are they addressing the correct uncertainties in scientific matter? I personally tend to defer to them in these matters, but it is worth asking these questions. A question I didn't put on here, which I'll end with, is whether or not the exclusivity period is the correct length of exclusivity period, and whether or not other policies we're considering, such as the new trade agreement, will have a positive or negative impact on that, are things that policymakers need to be thinking about. They won't be right in front of them some of the time. So with that, I think that wraps up my presentation. I'll let Adam take over.
Thank you. And Jeremy, that was a tour de force. But before we turn over to Adam, real quick, just to ask you, you talked about the difference between, or the legal difference between a biosimilar and an interchangeable, and some of the scientific difference. Has any interchangeable product been approved or thought about yet?
No, I don't believe any interchangeables have been approved. FDA is not. I have not heard FDA identify that they have received any interchangeables, and I don't know how many times companies have engaged with FDA on interchangeables. Because of confidentiality issues, FDA can't always be transparent about that, and it often depends on the companies involved saying, we have done these things. They do have some, where they have numbers, like where the number of enrollees in the biosimilar product development program, they're able to share that when it doesn't expose what the company is doing or what its trade so. But my sense is that that is not as robustly developed in the private sector space.
Adam.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start off by giving you a gift. I will not use PowerPoint slides. I know that's sort of non-traditional, but the other good news is Sarah said I may not do my presentation in interpretive dance. So we're going to just kind of run with it, but I think it'll be okay. That was very interesting what we heard, but I want to take a little bit of a different spin on what's actually been going on in the marketplace. Now, many people may not realize this, but our healthcare system is a little messed up. Have you heard this? You may have. And one of the things it's messed up in is the incentives are completely out of whack for almost everyone in the system, for payers, for physicians, for hospitals, for almost everyone, for wholesalers, for pharmacies, even for manufacturers. And those warped incentives, the distortions in our system, are leading us to not adopt biosimilars in a way that other countries have. Now, obviously, some of them haven't even been approved because of litigation issues, and I can't comment on that. But I want to just talk about the biosimilars and what's been happening in the marketplace. And I want to talk about the two kinds of biosimilars that have been approved. One kind, I think we mentioned there were 17 approved biosimilars. 4 of them are what we may call pharmacy benefit, the kind of prescription that you might get at a pharmacy or a mail pharmacy, where someone writes a prescription, you get a drug, you give it to yourself. The other 13, we'd call them medical benefit products, where typically it would be administered by a hospital or in a physician's office, where you'd have to go somewhere and have something infused. 13 of the products fall into that category. The one that we heard about earlier, Zarzu and Neupogen, fall into that medical benefit category. And each of them have very different reimbursement models. Let me talk about first the medical benefit, that buy and bill. And sometimes it's called buy and bill, if you're not familiar with that, because the provider, the hospital or the doctor's office, buys the drug, typically from a wholesaler, puts it into their inventory in their office, and you and I come in, they give us the drug, and then they bill the insurance company afterwards. So in that model, in the Medicare system, that would be under Part B, as in boy. In the commercial world, commercial health plans, it would be a medical benefit. And that system has created some very warped incentives. For example, in both Part B and in the commercial market, the hospitals or the physician offices are paid based on essentially a markup on the price of the drug, the pre-rebate, pre-discounted list price of the drug. So if I have a brand name drug that costs X, $100, and I have a biosimilar that costs $80, I, as the hospital or the physician, will actually make more money if I dispense the one that is $100. That slows the adoption of biosimilars in this country. The other thing that happens is sometimes for the other occurrence in our system is the presence of rebates or transactions that occur after the prescription is written or the drug is given between a manufacturer and a health plan, or a manufacturer and the agent of a health plan, called a pharmacy benefit manager, or PBM, which I'll talk about in a minute. And those transactions reduce the actual price of the drug to the payer, but may or may not affect what the patient pays or what the hospital gets. So for example, let's take that $100 drug, that could have a $50 rebate. And then the real cost of the plan could be just $50. But the patient may be asked to pay a percent of the $100. And that happens in the Medicare Part B system. It happens there through a program that I'm sure you may or may not be familiar with, 340B drug pricing program, one of my personal hobbies. It led to incredible distortions. In some cases, hospitals can buy drugs for 60 to 80% off the price that Medicare pays. They get that difference, but the Medicare patient has to pay a percent of that full price. Some hospitals will share the savings with the patients, but there's clear evidence from the GAO and others that some hospitals will not share the savings with the patients. So while I hear your point about patients not being able to afford prescriptions, and I'd love to come back to that later, in many cases, that money might be somewhere that's not going to the patient. So that creates some warped incentives in our system. And that's why when you see the data from Kaiser, it's very interesting. They somehow have I think you said 80% substitution rate, whereas the rate in the market overall, if I read that slide correctly, was 2.3%. We have to ask, why is it that every other hospital and doctor is thinking about this? When they save money on a drug, with all due respect, they're not using it to pay for another drug. They're not an insurer. That's just money that goes into their operations. And a lot of our health systems are very large. They're very powerful. They are technically nonprofit, but they behave in a profit-seeking way. So this has led to a very slow adoption of the biosimilars that have been launched. When you go over to the pharmacy benefit side, that looks more like the kind of drugs you and I get at a pharmacy. Now, of the 4 drugs that have been approved, none have been launched. 3 of them are biosimilars of the largest drug in the country, Humira. 2 of those 3, so now you're doing some math here, but 2 of the 4, if you will, have signed agreements with the manufacturer of Humira not to launch their product till 2023 in exchange for not being subject to litigation over the patent issues. One of them is not signed, as far as I know, and the other product is a biosimilar of a competitive product to Humira, and it is also engaged in some sort of litigation that I have a vague understanding of. When you get to the pharmacy benefit side, remember the products we're talking about are not generics. They're not interchangeable. They can't be automatically substituted. You know, today, in almost every single state, a pharmacist is required to automatically substitute a generic without even asking you, unless your doctor says, no, they must have the brand, or the payer says, we're not going to pay for the brand, the generic. But in almost every state, not every state, but in almost every state, the pharmacist has to do it. Here, biosimilars are not interchangeable. They can't be automatically substituted. The pharmacist can't say, hey, there's a biosimilar, I'm going to give you that one instead. They essentially are different drugs. For all practical purposes, they're the ultimate Me Too drug, which means your doctor has to write a separate prescription, which means that the control of what biosimilar gets used doesn't sit with the patient and is going to barely sit with the prescriber. It's really going to sit with the company or entity that's paying for our drugs, the employer, the government, whomever, and almost every one of them uses an independent agent or an agent they own called a pharmacy benefit manager to choose the drug. And we have a lot of really crazy warped incentives in the system. And one of the warped incentives we have is that it is often more attractive to a payer, to your employer, to pick a drug with a very high list price and a very big rebate as compared to picking a drug that just has a low price. This is a very complicated issue, and it is slowing and will continue to slow the adoption of biosimilars. And just to give you this, I'll go back to my $100 drug. That $100 drug with a $50 rebate is more attractive to a payer than a $50 drug, because the $50 is going somewhere. It's going back to the employer. It's going to lower the premiums of all the other people in the plan. It's going to offset other costs. It's essentially like money that comes later, like you can do whatever you want with it. And that kind of distortion is really affecting the ability of biosimilars to be adopted quickly. Now, my personal feeling is if you look at the pharma industry, and to zoom out for a minute, on that pharmacy benefit side, 9 out of 10 drugs dispensed in the US now, 90% are generic drugs. They're cheap, they're getting cheaper, they're in a massive deflationary cycle. Of the other 10%, a lot of them are these highly rebated drugs where it's hard to get that price down and people feel it. And you know, we have a number of drugs on the market now, biologics, which have been around for a while. They've had a good run, but it's very hard to be substituted. There's scientific issues, but there's also these reimbursement issues. And until we can kind of figure that out and have the same thing happen to biologic drugs that happen to brand name drugs that all became generic, we're not going to create the headroom to be able to afford the next generation of therapies. And I guess I'll make one other comment. Pharmaceuticals are, both the pharmacy and the medical benefit combined, about 15% of all that we spend on healthcare. Have been for quite a few years, projected to be so for the next few years. That 15%, we spend 99% of our time talking about it. We don't talk about the other 85%, and there's a good reason for that, which I don't have time to go into. But when we're talking about this, we're really talking about how do we just keep that 15% at 15%, which is not an unreasonable number. And I think that's a bigger question as we think about trying to get the system to adapt to biosimilars. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Adam, can I at the risk of sort of
No
listening
risk.
longer, ask her, I wanted to kind of just clarify for a second, because when you talked about the 4 biosimilars that are approved that are under the more of like the pharmacy benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be Medicare Part D as in dog, right? And then the 13 would be the medical benefit under Medicare Part B as in boy.
Correct.
And then you talked a little bit about sort of the pharmacy benefits. So can you just talk a little bit more about kind of how the rebate system you talked about like relates to sort of those two, at least as far as the currently on the market, and then how does that translate into the commercial market, just to kind of clarify
Okay.
where it
Sure.
shakes out for everyone.
Rebates are primarily in that pharmacy benefits side of the world, both in the commercial insurance and in Medicare Part D. Medicare Part D rebates are about $30 billion. In commercial, maybe it's about $45 billion total that represent on average 40% or more off the list price of the drug, in some cases 80% off. On the medical benefit side, Medicare Part B doesn't have rebates for the government, but it does have on the commercial side, so like a commercial health plan or an insurance company could negotiate an arrangement with a manufacturer to have rebates to sort of drive product selection. They tend to be used less often there, because on the pharmacy benefit side, we all know you go into the pharmacy and you show your card and they swipe it and they say, oh, this drug is or is not covered. And you can then do something about it or not, pick it up, not pick it up, whatever. In the medical benefit side, remember I said it's buy and bill. So in many cases, the physician has a lot more autonomy. And again, this may not be a surprise. Physicians generally don't like insurance companies. They don't like taking medical advice from insurance companies. So they want to make that decision. And in some cases, they will actually give that drug and then say, well, I billed it. That's it. So there's many fewer restrictions on what physicians can do. So, you don't have as much ability, the health plan doesn't have as much ability to control things. One of the proposals that HHS has put out is to try to bring some of the tools that health plans in the commercial side try to use into Medicare Part B, but that's very controversial.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've talked about the scientific issues, some of the regulatory issues, some of the reimbursement issues, and then, of course, at the end, it all comes down to how does this affect the patient? So, Anna, could you share some of your insights with us? Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me to be here. This is a really rock star panel. Have been with Arthritis Foundation for about 5 years, so it's kind of interesting to see the arc where 5 years ago we didn't have any biosimilars approved, let alone on the market, and now we've got 17 approved and however many on the market, 3, and 2 of them are for arthritis, which actually leads me to my first point, which is why does this matter for people with arthritis? People with arthritis, particularly rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, other forms, rely on biologic medications to stay healthy. There are a lot of rheumatologists who treated arthritis patients pre-biologic, and they describe their waiting rooms as a sea of wheelchairs, and that's not true anymore because of biologic medicines. So they really have been game changers for people with arthritis. And because it's a chronic disease, people who are on a biologic medication can maybe anticipate being on one for the rest of their life. So the access and the cost really, really matter for this population. So there are 7 that have been approved in this therapeutic area, and 2 are currently on market. And what's interesting there is that they're both on the medical benefit side, and they're both for the same reference product. And I believe we're the only therapeutic area for which that is true so far. So it gives us kind of a real life test case of what's going on, at least with CMS policies in that space. Out-of-pocket costs always rank high on our surveys. We do surveys regularly of our patient population. It's always up there. And then really, what we've been saying for years is that biosimilars hold promise for reducing costs and thereby increasing access. And I'm not just talking about being able to go to the pharmacy counter and pick up your drug, but what you heard earlier about being able to adhere better to your drug. Okay, so that brings up 2 questions. What do patients with arthritis think about biosimilars, and are they using them? On the first question, we have done a couple of surveys now, and this is from 2017, and 5 years ago, just the way that we've talked about and thought about biosimilars has evolved greatly. I'm really curious to see how the next 5 years evolves, but I would almost say that this data is old now, even though it was only a couple of years ago. Less than half in this survey were familiar with biosimilars, and 27% had never heard the term. I wouldn't be surprised if that data tracks similarly to what we would find now, and I imagine that we will repeat this survey sometime soon. There's confusion about the difference between a biologic and a biosimilar, and frankly, a lot of patients are confused about what a biologic is, period. It is a complex medication. People, they know the basics maybe, they listen to what their doctor has to say, they look for information in various places, and if the medicine works for them, they're happy. A little over half of respondents said that they would be confident using a biosimilar knowing they have been approved by the FDA. And that data has borne out in other focus groups and things that we've done. People trust the FDA. If it's approved by the FDA, it's a trusted resource for them. And really, they care deeply about, this comes up over and over, I can't stress this enough, the provider-patient relationship. They want decisions about switching to be made at the provider level. I feel like, and not just about biosimilars, but when we talk to patients about what their challenges are in the healthcare system, over and over and over again, it's really about control and stability and being able to have some control over what's happening to them in their treatment decisions. And then once they're on a medication that works for them, it is so vitally important to them that they're able to stay on that medication. We hear that over and over and over again. It often can take a long time to get diagnosed, and when we talk to patients about what that experience is like, it's very dark for them, and they just want their life back. That's what we hear a lot. And so once they find something, it really is miraculous for them. Okay, so are patients then taking biosimilars if it's supposed to reduce costs and increase access? And an answer, no. And you've already heard that today. Biosimilars have not been able to crack into the market to the rate at which maybe some of us anticipated a few years ago. Why would an arthritis patient not take a biosimilar? Based on our conversations, surveys, focus groups, et cetera, there's a few key themes that come up. One is simply they don't know about them. They're most likely going to find out information about treatment decisions, treatment options from their healthcare provider. So if a doctor isn't talking to them about it, they're not likely going to go then look. You don't know what you don't know, right? They're not going to go looking around for information on something that they're not familiar with. I think that this has changed a bit. It's starting to change a little bit, at least in the rheumatology space. More providers are talking to their patients more often about these drugs. They fear that they won't work as well, and you've heard that already today as well. And I don't think that that's a scientific issue. I think it's an emotional one, and I hear that from providers too. I don't think that just exists on the patient level. I think it exists at the provider level too. They have concerns about interchangeability, and I really think that that is a matter of not understanding what interchangeability is, and I think that goes for a lot of us. It's not just a patient issue. Interchangeability is really just a flashpoint for a lot of us. And then really, ultimately, aside from hearing about it from your provider and having those conversations, it's having access through your formulary or your out-of-pocket cost being significantly lower. I mean, truly, the value proposition of a generic for a patient is the lower cost. The same would be true for a biosimilar. If it's clinically efficacious and it's equivalent to the biologic drug, why would you want to switch to it? Because it costs less. It's going to impact your pocketbook, and perhaps your administrative burden is going to be lower as well. The other thing is, because we have 7 biosimilars approved for arthritis and only 2 on the market, we have to sort of be careful about how we talk about the promise to patients, right? Because if we say all of these great things about how it can make your, life a little bit easier because you're not stepping through as many hoops, or your, out-of-pocket cost is lower, and then they go say, okay, healthcare provider, I really want to try a biosimilar. And the healthcare provider then has to say, well, guess what? 5 of them aren't on the market, and you can't access it. Literally, you cannot access this medication. We have to be careful about sort of tempering expectations, right, with our patients. So that's the other kind of piece there. So where do patients turn for information on biosimilars? Their healthcare provider, we've already talked about that. That really is the key source that patients go to for information. The FDA is another one. We've talked about that as well. Kind of the third that ranked really high on our list when we did the survey was they look on the internet, for better and worse. So 46% in our survey back in 2017 went to the internet looking. And if you Google search biosimilars, the first 5 or 6 searches that come up are pharmaceutical company ads, right? And then eventually you get down to maybe the FDA and some other places. There's a lot of biased information and misinformation around what biosimilars are. And I think what we've seen when we talk to patients about what they find on the internet about biosimilars is it just adds to their confusion as opposed to lessening their confusion. That's become a particularly big flashpoint for us in the last year or so, and trying to combat some of that. So what are we doing with these insights? Really, I mean, we've done patient education around biosimilars for a number of years now, and I think what we've learned, particularly in the past year, with what we've seen in the marketplace, is that what we want to do is normalize the term biosimilars. That's really what we're talking about. If patients are confused about biologics, let alone biosimilars, and providers aren't necessarily talking to them about it, or even maybe providers are confused about what some of the differences are. What we really need to do now is normalize the term, make it a comfortable term, make it a household term, which it really isn't at the moment. Working with provider groups on patient education, this is another key piece. I hope I've made that case throughout this presentation, it's not just about us educating patients, it's about providers being comfortable with talking about biosimilars to their patients. Working with the FDA, which we are actively doing. I know they're working on building out a suite of patient education materials, and we are working actively with them, and we really appreciate the level at which they've engaged with us throughout this process. Working with stakeholders, actually I see a lot of people in this room who we're working with on a regular basis, and it really goes back to that normalizing piece and making sure we're all using the same terminology to talk about biosimilars, that we're talking about these things, that we're addressing what are the barriers to getting these things out there a little bit more, and that we're coming up with some consensus around how to get past those barriers. And then continuing to survey and focus group our patients. We want to have that continuous touch point to know what is happening with them, what they're thinking about these things, et cetera. We have seen, we have a number of rheumatologists who work closely with us, and I had an interesting conversation just a couple of weeks ago with one who is very steeped in healthcare policy issues and made the decision within his practice to switch every single patient onto one of the biosimilars that are on the market. And I thought that was really interesting, and and for him it was, I believe personally in the value of biosimilars to increase access for patients over time. And so I wanted to take this step. Part of what I really want to do in the coming months is to find other providers who have done that and really ask those kinds of questions. Well, what is that experience like? How did your patients respond to that? Have there been any issues? So that we can have some of that real world evidence around what's happening in the US. I think that's another thing that people are really interested to see. What is happening with patients as we're switching them to biosimilars in the United States? So with that, I will end and ready for questions.
Thank you so much. So we're going to have about half an hour for questions. I want to kind of lead off maybe by asking, kind of bringing it full circle and asking you, Samir, since you are you are practicing, like, do you have reflections on kind of what Anna talked about, and like just bring us into that conversation? Like, what is that conversation like when someone is starting on a biologic, like let alone a biosimilar? I mean, is this all kind of new to people? Can you kind of illustrate that for us? And then as you all are thinking about your questions, we have a mic and we're going to ask you to raise your hands and speak loudly. But first, go ahead, Samir.
Some might actually take a step back, and it really needs to engage not only the physicians, but the patients as well. And Adam actually brought up this warped incentives, as he mentioned it, and I believe that's true. And I feel so fortunate to actually work in an integrated delivery system where the physicians actually come up with the formulary. So it's not Mother May I calling some insurance company saying, what can I prescribe? Or this is the only choice that's available. We actually start with our physicians and pharmacists looking at the evidence. If one of the products is actually superior to the other one, there is no way we're going to take the other product, because as physicians, we would not feel that would be what we would do for ourselves or our friends, our family, or our patients. Once we're able to look at that research ourselves and we find equivalent products, we're actually able to get pharmacy contracting to go get a good contract. And that's why we actually have that buy-in that you're talking about from the physician side. We've looked at the research ourselves, and we actually go to the right specialists for this kind of thing. I'm an internal medicine physician. I'm not the health plan's physician. I'm actually one of the practicing physicians. We would actually ask our rheumatology colleagues to take a look at the rheumatology literature. What do they understand and what products would they get? And that's how it ends up on the formulary. So there is a lot of buy-in when the products are actually picked by the physicians and pharmacists themselves based on evidence. We don't actually participate in the 340B at all, and we actually are our own PBM, and we don't like rebates. So that helps as well. So we'd just like you to lower the price if that's appropriate. So that's kind of why it works in our system. And so the physicians understand what they have on the formulary and why it works, and it's based on evidence. Then it's a lot easier for me to then have that discussion with my patient who trusts me. As you actually pointed out, Anna, most of the information actually comes from the physician's office. And if I have no perverse incentive of making money on one or the other one, actually just picking the right one that's going to help my patient, that sort of solves the issue as well for us.
I think, Samir, you actually said the number one thing there, the magic, we're not 340B. If you've been following the 340B dynamic in the hospital system, it has created incredible warped incentives. In fact, a typical 340B hospital will make 4 to 5 times as much from a biological arthritis drug than the manufacturer will make. And I show you the math on my blog, Drug Channels. Free to subscribe, you can check it out, but I can walk through the math. That is an amazing distortion in the system and encourages or discourages the adoption of biosimilars. And I'll just mention one other little factoid, another fun fact for you. When the biosimilars launched, to your point, Anna, in 2017, 50% of health plans didn't cover biosimilars at all. They wouldn't pay for them. Last year, that dropped to only 1/3 wouldn't cover biosimilars. So they are preferring the brands. And this is kind of the distortion in the system. And if you listen to the hearings on Tuesday, you heard manufacturers and senators talking about these distortions in the system that are lowering prices, but not to the patient, and creating, some warped incentives in our system. That's kind of what's going on.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Any response to that?
I just want to point out a couple of things that may be getting glossed over here that are less about biosimilars, but more about some of what we talk about. One is on 340B, one of the things to remember is that best estimates on what the impact of 340B is on the drug spend in this country is less than 2% of the drug spend in this country. So even if you accept that it is a market distortion, which I don't always accept, it's important to understand that it is being discussed in a way as if it is one of the core problems with the system, and it simply is not. And this also goes back to the rebates issue. I think there's a lot of accurate statements here about the impact of rebates in the system, but we need to understand that those rebates have come about because of the high list prices that the drug companies have done, and the drug companies have then used these high list prices to drive, they've used the rebates to allow them to drive even higher list prices. So we need to look at that whole picture and all of it together. The complexity of this is not to be underestimated, and there probably are policy answers that have to do with addressing rebates and so forth, but we need to remember that those answers have got to be in the context of other changes that are also being done around this, but that's bigger than biosimilars by a light year. So
I would say that 2% figure, with all due respect, Jeremy, is a complete fabrication. Remember, that I said there's pharmacy benefit and there's medical benefit. 80% of what we spend is pharmacy benefit. There's really no 340B there. 20% of what we spend on drugs is medical benefit spending. That's where all the 340B is. So if you want to use your denominator, that entire thing, you can get it down to that low single digits. But if you just look at where 340B actually happens, right now, about half of all hospital purchases are purchased using 340B, 50%. Now you want to divide that over this giant number, it looks small, but that's really, fun with math.
So let me, because I think it's fair to say we could probably spend the entire hour and a half or more on just kind of understanding 340B and
Cool. No, sorry.
we might have to make you guys stay after class. But can I just to kind of, and maybe not to put too fine a point on it, but I mean, it sounds like what's emerging from this discussion is, kind of biosimilars is like a microcosm of part of this broader debate, or policy debate around drug pricing, but that there's some unique attributes to biosimilars, and that perhaps what I'm hearing from Adam, and I'm not sure so much from Jeremy, but like on this 340B issue is that because it affects hospitals and because, as we noted before, the majority of these biosimilars are the Part B buy and bill, that's kind of, why, is that why there's more at stake here? Is that why perhaps this issue affects
Yeah, I mean,
biosimilars more?
Kaiser is a little bit of an exception, and
Okay.
I credit you for actually kind of taking the lead there. But if you look at the marketplace where you see biosimilar is having greater adoption in physician practices versus hospital outpatient departments. Hospital outpatients, especially those that are 340B, have essentially negative incentives, let's call them disincentives, to adopt biosimilars, as I mentioned. And the physician practices, they don't have access to 340B, so they're in some sense buying from a wholesaler at some price and getting reimbursed, often don't have the ability to get reimbursed as much. I mean, on average, hospitals get reimbursed twice as much as a physician practice for the exact same drug, the exact same arthritis drug, the exact same biologic. Hospitals get 2x what a physician gets. So they're much more sensitive to these issues and trying to figure out how to be more profitable and stay in business. But for the hospitals, there's some major distortions. It's just sort of the economic reality. It's not an opinion.
Great.
Well, and I was just going to say, I mean, I think it is important to understand, I recognize that this is true in part because of what biosimilars are and what biosimilars are not. Like this goes back to, we keep expecting biosimilars to be like the generic market, and biosimilars will not. There's an open question about whether or not interchangeables may get to that place, but biosimilars are not statutorily meant to be at that space. They're not scientifically meant to be in that space. Whenever you're going to have the prescriber in being the first gatekeeper on whether or not this will be substituted, you can't use the other market tools. That doesn't mean that what Adam's describing is not accurate in terms of some of the other market incentives that disrupt this, but it all comes back to that issue, I think, and why it doesn't.
I mean, that's a great point, Jeremy. I mean, and that's, I think, one reason why you see hospitals have essentially been very actively acquiring physician practices. I mean, if you went back 10 years ago, roughly 10% of all oncology practices were owned by a health system. Last year, it was closer to 50%. So essentially, the prescriber and the hospital are now the same entity. They've vertically integrated and kind of have these little local monopolies that they can negotiate with health plans over. So it gives them a lot of economic power to both be the prescriber and the decider in setting their hospital formulary. So it's a really complicated market. And, like I said, for better or worse, we have a profit-driven healthcare system, which has good things and bad things. And one of the potential problems is you have entities that try to create power in a market, and that's what we have in a lot of local markets, local healthcare markets.
I just wanted to focus us back on biologics as to why they're important. As
Good
you
idea.
pointed out, in 2006, they never existed. And if we looked at how we spent our pharmacy budget, and last year we spent $10 billion, 32% of that went into biologics. We're thinking in the next 2 years it's going to be 50%, and in the next 7 years it's going to be 78%. So we really need to have something happen in this biosimilar space, because as a country, as a health system, as patients, we simply cannot afford these if this is what's going to keep happening.
I mean,
And I know you mentioned drug prices have hung around 15%. So if they can hang around there, that'd be great. But if they kept going and going, that would be an issue. And I would actually take, you mentioned something about generics not going up. There's data to show that in a time period, some of the generic costs went up 200%. And some of those folks have been right here on the Hill, where something that costs $20 is now $900 or several $1,000s. So I know those are sensational stories, but definitely the cost of drugs for an integrated delivery system, if I look back in 1997, it was a certain amount. It's gone to double digits. It's actually more than what we pay for our physicians today. So. And the cost continues to rise. Well, I look at my financials and you haven't, so I can actually.
Well, the
say
American
that.
Hospital Association says drugs are and have been 6 to 7% of hospital expenses for the last 15 years. Physician salaries, hospital administrator salaries, outsourced personal services are 80%. There's just no way drugs are more than physician salaries. That's just not mathematically possible.
So, clearly, there's some disagreement. Probably not going to resolve it on this panel, but
A different topic.
a
so-
different topic. I do want to refocus on the biologics. I just want to ask you. I do want to ask you though. I mean, that's kind of remarkable that in 13 years, your drug spend kind of shifting to biologics in that way. I mean, do these have the potential to like perhaps offset other spending? Like what's happening to the rest of that pie chart as you are looking at the drug spend? And then I am going to open it up to the audience for questions.
Well, for some of them, it's actually too early to tell, but you mentioned some of our patients who don't then progress with their rheumatoid arthritis, and they're actually functioning, and going to someone's graduation can open a jar, button their clothes. So that definitely can help. Some of the drugs, we're not sure. Sometimes it's supposed to prevent a bone marrow transplant, the CAR T, and we've had people who failed it. They've had a second one, now they've had a bone marrow transplant. So some of the research is being done by the health delivery system today to see what's going to happen with some of these things.
Great.
But hopefully if it changes the equation elsewhere, people are not hospitalized and actually, better quality of life, then we definitely want that.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 15 minutes. I'm going to open up for questions. And sorry, we don't have a usual kind of standing. We do have one standing mic, but I'm going to go ahead and you can ask your question, and then the young lady over there. So just speak up, if you will. Yes, thank you.
What's the biggest obstacle to biosimilar uptake? And regardless if the answer isn't patents, on the issue of patents, can you talk a little bit about whether you can fix the drug patent problem without affecting patents for other products? And within the patent debate, what are the biggest problems? Is it paper delay? Is it the patent ticket? Is it rims of use? Go.
All right, I heard like three questions. One was, what's the biggest barrier? Yes, 3 questions. One of the biggest barrier to biosimilar uptake. Can you change the patent laws for biosimilars without affecting other patent laws? And then within the patent system. Okay, so try, if you guys would, to kind of get to that question, then we'll get to the young lady's question over here. Thanks.
So my limited knowledge and gut tell me that the biggest obstacle to uptake right now is actually the lack of understanding and awareness and appreciation of the value of biosimilars by patients, providers, and payers together, right? And that dovetails into some of the things that Adam's described in terms of the way the market, their ability to purchase these things. I believe the lack of a functioning purchasing market at the back end of the process is what's holding things up the most. In terms of patents, I think patents, it's clear based on the litigation that's holding up some of the marketing of some of these biosimilars that have been approved by FDA that the patents are clearly playing a role there and are being utilized to block competition. And I think it's very clear that in the generic drug space, in the broader pharmaceutical space, that's also continues to be the case, that patents are a major obstacle to competition. One of the challenges that we would face if we tried to change the way patents themselves, and we should separate patents from exclusivities because these are different things. Patents, my understanding is that some of our trade policies have meant that we cannot arbitrarily treat different industries differently under the patent system. So there are some limitations there. I haven't delved as much into that. Maybe my colleagues have more understanding, but that would be my quick answer on that.
Go ahead, Samir.
I would say agree with that, the education and trust. I mean, first, patients have to understand what these are, and physicians have to understand what these are, and in that relationship, feel that they're doing what's clinically right for that patient. So the trust and belief that these products actually work is one of the biggest things, and I'm really not a patent lawyer, so I can't tell you more about it other than the fact that a lot of those products are held up. I just sort of showed that to you on the slide.
Well, I'm not a lawyer either, but I guess I'll put it this way. When I was young, I'd be like, oh man, it's all just about the money. But now that I'm old, I know it's all about the money.
Well, yeah, I think it is, going back to the knowledge factor and the data that we have that shows that the average patient doesn't know what a biosimilar is and why should they, what, right. and they are going into their doctor's office. The doctor is the front line at talking about the treatment options for the patient. Perhaps the patient ahead of time or certainly afterwards is going online and trying to find more information, but to my earlier point, they tend to walk away more confused by that than less. And so I think that's where that normalizing piece will help to instill the trust factor.
Thank you. Hopefully they'll go online and see the recording of this briefing and it'll shed some light on the topic. I saw a question over here. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anita from Senator Smith's office. So insulin, the high insulin was approved under the 505(b)(2) pathway, so it's not, and will transition to biologic in 2020, so it's not quite in the same bucket as like some other biologics. But so what are some legislative fixes that could help bring more insulin biosimilars into market or in the short term?
So this is the issue of the day. It's a good question. It's a really good question. It's one that many people are asking, and it's obviously come up in most of the congressional hearings that have addressed this, as insulin has become a poster child of some of the challenges we have in drug pricing and some of the weaknesses in the market that we see. First thing, you referenced this, so the Affordable Care, the BPCIA transitioned these 505(b)(2) products like insulin to become biosimilars in March of 2020. And unfortunately, what that's meant is that there's a period of time where you could use the old generic pathway for these products to get it, but if you didn't get approved in the window before March of 2020, your application would go away and you'd have to resubmit a new biosimilar application under the other pathway. And that has made it, I think, a challenge for some companies to step in and offer that. I don't think that's the whole problem, but I think that is one of the problems that existed there. And I think the question will be whether or not post-March 2020, we see the biosimilar pathway being an effective way of creating competition. That being said, we have, what, 4 or 5 different major insulin products on the market today, and their pricing just keeps going up and keeps, I think there's people should be looking at whether or not it's the lack of competition that is enabling that, or is it something else in the way the system is working to address that?
Two quick comments on it. First of all, insulin is a broken therapeutic category from a payment perspective. The list prices have been going up consistently, but the actual net price has been flat. And what's happened is insulins are now sold to payers at discounts that average about 80 to 85%, yet increasingly patients have to pay something based on that list price. So the system is completely out of whack. And I think most people would like to see that rebate system reformed so that we can actually change that. But if you look at insulin, it's actually an interesting category because there is a drug on the market that is a follow-on biologic. It is technically a biosimilar in Europe, but it's a follow-on biologic, and Jeremy could probably explain the difference if you care to know. But what's happened is the innovator product, which is a Sanofi product called Lantus, has lost more than half of its sales, primarily through discounts, and switching to this follow-on biologic, which is called Basaglar, manufactured by Eli Lilly. And so you actually have seen a big shift there, and that has reduced costs. And in fact, one of the things that we even heard from the CEO of Sanofi on Tuesday was that although they've raised the list prices on average about 4%, their actual net prices went down by about 9% because of all these other rebates and discounts. And so, it's a category where the patient is really being hurt by the system, of rebates, where the actual price is not visible, but it's very easy for a politician to tweet and comment on the list price without really understanding what's actually happening to the money. But I'll save that for another time.
I did want to ask because oh, sorry. One of the areas we haven't delved into too much, but you just touched on it, Adam, is this issue of patient cost sharing. And so I want to spend a minute on it because, we've talked about patient access and affordability, but can you sort of touch on how does patient cost sharing work in some of these scenarios? And again, kind of going back to the mode of delivery or, who the payer is, what could some of the different effects be on the patient cost sharing?
Well, let's start with some facts. I'm a big believer in the belief in saying everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. The facts are people who have insurance, 85% of the people who have insurance pay less than $20 a month. Half of those people don't even take any pharmaceuticals. Another 10% spend less than $40 a month. We have a few people who end up spending a lot. And what's happening is there's been a change in benefit design. We have a world of 90% generic dispensing. 10 years ago, that was 55%. So we've had massive generic substitution. They're very cheap. Most people can take those. So we find that where cost sharing is coming in, it's increasingly for people in a deductible or in coinsurance. More than half of all patient out-of-pocket are now coinsurance or deductibles. Those are tied to this bogus list price. And so for biologics, for insulins, for other things, people are paying on this list price even though your employer, the insurance company, whomever, is getting a large discount. And that's, kind of warped patient perspective of cost sharing. It's warped how our system works. It's gotten real out of control. I mean, I've called it the gross to net bubble. That was the term that HHS adopted, in fact, in their proposal to change the rebate system in Part D and managed Medicaid. So it is a big problem, and it's affecting patient cost sharing and distorting even our ability to have a sensible conversation about drug pricing. I mean, we can't even have a sensible conversation anymore. It's very frustrating. I don't like reading the news.
I don't think anyone does. Anyone want to, Jeremy, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, one of the, the answer that HHS has put forward is to get rid of the rebates, and I won't debate that because I'm still thinking about what I think about that particular proposal. But one of the other things that people should consider is whether or not cost sharing should still be tied back to list price, and whether or not cost sharing should be tied to what the net price is, and that's something that has come up over the years with different pieces of legislation, and it'd be interesting to see if that's part of the debate that comes in the next 6 months to a year.
Thank you.
And I think that would be a good first step.
So the issue with coinsurance is large, not just because of all of the reasons that Adam teed up, but also because the percentage of coinsurance is rising too in places that we're able to see that. So Federal Exchange plans every year, we're seeing that coinsurance number rise. Medicare, 100% of Medicare plans use coinsurance, Part D plans, and certainly for rheumatoid arthritis, we're one of the therapeutic areas where you're more likely to end up in that catastrophic phase. Right, so the out-of-pocket issue there is really huge, and even in the employer market, in the last 15 years, the number of plans using specialty tiers and requiring coinsurance has risen dramatically.
And I'm kind of curious. One of the things that I think about, there's a survey United Healthcare did of consumers and asked them, do you understand basic insurance terms, out-of-pocket maximum, coinsurance, things like that? And like for coinsurance, they said, how many people have a good understanding of the term coinsurance, which is now dominant for specialty products? It was like 35%. Like 2 out of 3 people did not understand coinsurance. And that's the dominant form of insurance. So you want to ask people why people are mad, they don't even understand their benefits.
Yeah, that tracks really closely, actually, with what we find in our surveys. We actually, for the first time, we do a survey at least once a year asking about what I would call health coverage literacy. And this year, for the first time, we asked in a series of terms, including some of these like coinsurance, copayment, specialty tier, et cetera, how comfortable would you feel telling a friend what that means? And it is exactly as you would expect. That coinsurance is not a household term for the average patient.
It really lowers the quality of health policy debate to a lot of demagoguery and populist things that we don't get into the real issues. And nerds like me really want to get into the real issues.
And that's what we're all about. And I think to the real issues, and I think just to clarify, I mean, again, kind of to go back to like this Medicare question and the mode of delivery, that people who have a Part B benefit under Medicare, that is a different mode of cost sharing than people who have a Part D plan, oftentimes. And so that's kind of, the factual basis for sort of what might be at stake here. So I do want to, I want to just kind of survey the audience and see if like anyone has a burning question that they would like to ask. We definitely still have time for a question or two. Okay, great. Go ahead, and then you, ma'am, and then we will probably close. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is pretty broad. I'm hoping the panel can maybe provide some context more broadly for the health of the biosimilars market. And so we got the sense from you, Dr. Asare, that Kaiser has shown the potential, and you cited that RAND report that shows the potential for enormous cost savings, but we hear about how the U.S. is really leading the way in product development in pharmaceuticals more broadly, but Europe is so far ahead of the U.S. when it comes to uptake for biosimilars. And so I'm curious what your broad perspectives are for whether we're in a position where the floodgates are going to open and we're a couple of years away from seeing a U.S. biosimilars market that's closer to the 50 drugs that they have on the market in Europe, or if biosimilars are sort of languishing in the U.S. and there's a threat that we're on a tipping point to sort of go the other way and see companies less interested in investing in this space.
Thank you. All right. Anyone want to take first stab at that?
Well, I live by the crystal ball, so I don't mind eating broken glass. Within 5 years, we're going to have a very vibrant biosimilar market, and you're going to see the prices of biologics for many of them plummet. Humira, which is the #1 selling product in the country, is going to face enormous biosimilar competition. Now, it's not till 2023, and that's for a lot of reasons which I don't want to get into, but that you're going to see the payers play off the biosimilars against each other. You also have all the PBMs absorbed into health insurance companies now, so I think we're going to move there. But it requires reform of some of the things we've talked about to motivate the providers, particularly the hospital systems on the buy and bill side. The PBMs will probably go for it if there's enough competition and they can create, negotiations. So I think within 5 years, it's going to be there. And I'd also just credit FDA Commissioner Gottlieb for really pushing this harder than his predecessors and trying to say, let's go, putting the pedal to the metal to try to get this to happen.
So I don't disagree with Adam on the general thrust of things. He knows more about what may be driving industry and so forth in terms of the financial side of this. But what I will say is I will take issue with what he said about his predecessors not putting the pedal to the metal. The BPCI created a new pathway that fundamentally altered the way FDA and its scientists and its reviewers were going to consider the safety and efficacy of these products, these very complicated products, which have a great deal of potential but also carry with them some risk. And FDA had to take some time to understand how they were going to collect the data that meant that when they approved a product, they could be confident that it could be on the market with a minimum of risk to the patients. And FDA took that time, and it continues to take that time. And I think one of the things when you look at how FDA talks about its approval standards is it talks about a stepwise approach. Do an analytical study to characterize the product and compare it. Do a functional assay to compare it. Do some human PK and PD studies. And getting away from the jargon of this, what they're essentially saying is the more your early information can tell us that we should have a high degree of confidence that these are biosimilar, the less clinical data you'll need at the back end for us to approve it. And that also means that the more applications that come in, the more different kinds of data that come in, the more experience FDA has reviewing those products, the more comfortable they will become approving these products at the back end on less and less data. There's a limit to that at some point, but I think over time, we're already seeing the acceleration of these products, and I think it's less to do with. I applaud Commissioner Gottlieb and what he's done. I don't think he's taken a misstep in this space, but I think it's less to do with him beating the drum and saying let's do this faster, and more to do with the fact that CDER and CBER and the review staff and the policy staff there have become more familiar with this space and how it can work, and I think that will continue, and I think that will drive more market uptake, and I think at the end of the day, the amount of savings that are available will cause people to want to make this work.
I'm optimistic that we'll have more products. I'm not as optimistic that the prices will go down because as you've looked at any other types of medications, that really has not been the case. Competition has really not worked in this space. I mean, if you remember those flat screen TVs, remember when they came out, they were $10,000 or $15,000, and now you can order one online or walk into a store and get it for $300 or $400. Well, think back about 10 years ago, there was one multiple sclerosis drug, it was $10,000. Today we have 14 or 15 maybe, I've missed one, and they're all $50,000 to $60,000. So competition has not lowered the price in almost every drug category, whether it's the list price or whatever price they've given, but somebody puts the list price and then gives you a rebate. So if you kept the list price low and give a rebate, that's a whole different story. You keep raising the price and you keep giving a rebate, but the total price does not go down. Competition has not worked in this space. So yes, we'll have lots of products. I'm still concerned that the prices may not go down like they've gone down in Europe.
And I'll rebut that next time.
Okay.
Okay, and if anyone wants more information about rebates, I will just put in a plug that the Alliance did do a briefing last November, and if you want more information, check out our website, ask our staff. It should give you a good grounding for what's going on currently and what's going on with this proposed rule. You had a question, and then that will be our final question. For those of you who do need to run to another meeting, please don't leave without filling out your blue evaluation. We really do use them. Yes, ma'am.
What do we know about how payers are treating biosimilars as far as formulary tiers? Are they treating them like generics, or they're not generics? So are we going to see them on the brand tiers?
Biosimilars right now are being treated as Me Too brands, if you will. Again, they're not really, if you look at like Basaglar and Lantus, that's a pharmacy benefit. Those are, situations where they're preferring one versus the other, especially for new patients instead of switching patients. On the medical benefit, as I mentioned, a third of health plans don't even cover some of the don't cover the biosimilars at all. 40% put them on an equal tier, and about the remainder favoring the biosimilar. So, you're seeing kind of a shift a little bit, but they're treating them right now in that way. And because they aren't generics, they can't be auto-substituted. State laws apply to auto-substitution of generics. They don't apply to auto-substitution of biosimilars. In fact, there's a lot of state laws that say you can't auto-substitute. So. Well, again, if they're, I don't know the science. If they're legitimately not interchangeable, I don't necessarily want my local pharmacist making an interchange. But if they are, and I'll defer to the FDA on that, we'll then have at it, and then it'll look just like the generic market. But, that's not where we are now. But the more competition you create between these products, the more prices go down, just like, Kaiser created competition between Zarxio and Neupogen, and I assume lowered the price that they're paying. And some portion of that savings probably benefited the patient, some of it benefited Kaiser. We don't know how much. But whenever there's competition, multiple therapies in a therapeutic class, there's bigger discounts and bigger rebates.
All right, so I think we have come to the end of our time and certainly opened up a lot of really fascinating issues. I want to thank all of our panelists for really bringing your time and your expertise on this enormously complex issue. Hopefully we can say a little bit in case anyone has follow-up questions. Thank all of you for bringing your focus and attention here. And once again, thank you, Johnson & Johnson, for making this possible. Please do fill out your blue evaluation forms. We really use them. Quality is important to us. Join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.